Hello, y'all. It's Dr. G, and today we're stepping into an era that glitters in the popular imagination, the 1950s, the heart of what is often called the affluent society. Think Leave It to Beaver. Imagine a nation emerging victorious from a global conflict, wary of the large shadows of war and the economic depression. Suddenly, the United States is stepping into an age of unprecedented economic boom. Picture the gleaming chrome of new automobiles rolling down freshly paved highways, the neat rows of suburban houses with their white picket fences, little boxes made of ticky tack. There was also the families gathered around the flickering blue glow of a brand new technology, the television set. This was the image of the American dream, broadcast not just across the nation, but to an eagerly watching world. In 1959, at the American National Exhibition in Moscow, a potent symbol of this era unfolded. Vice President Richard Nixon, standing in a model American kitchen, engaged in a now famous kitchen debate with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. Nixon proudly declared, quote, "Let us start with some of the things in this exhibit. You will see a house, a car, a television set, each the newest and most modern of its type we can produce. But can only the rich in the United States afford such things? If this were the case, we would have to include in our definition of rich the millions of American wage earners." End quote. Nixon's words captured the narrative, a widespread material prosperity, a testament to the American way of life. Yet as we peel back the shiny veneer, a more complicated picture emerges. As our textbook so aptly puts it was defined by, quote, unrivaled prosperity alongside crippling poverty, expanded opportunity alongside entrenched discrimination, and new liberating lifestyles alongside stifling conformity. And it was certainly not Leave It to Beaver or I Love Lucy for everybody. The very celebration of this affluence was, in itself, a Cold War strategy against the Soviet Union. Nixon wasn't just showing off a modern kitchen, he was wielding American consumer goods as an ideological weapon against Soviet communism. The American standard of living was presented as proof of capitalism's superiority. This intense politicization meant that questioning this narrative, pointing out the poverty or the deep-seated inequalities or even the racism, could be dismissed as un-American, or worse, sympathetic to the communist cause. This pressure to conform contributed to a veneer of national unity and success, carefully constructing an image after the traumas of depression and war. But this image glossed over deep anxieties and the stark reality that this prosperity was not universally experienced. The affluent society narrative was, in part, an exercise in selective memory, papering over societal fissures that would soon crack wide open in the 1960s. So in today's episode, we'll delve into these contradictions of the affluent society. We'll explore how the economic engine roared, who reaped the benefits, and who was systematically left behind. We'll examine how this period of paradoxical plenty laid the groundwork for the profound social changes of the 1960s, our topic in a later episode, and how all of this connects to the long arc of American history that we've been tracing from Reconstruction, from its unfulfilled promises to the industrial titans of the Gilded Age, through the crucibles of world wars and Great Depressions, to the complex moment of this abundance and anxiety. To understand the affluent society, we must first look at the seeds from which it grew, seeds of both unprecedented prosperity and profound division, basically our previous episodes. The economic devastation of the Great Depression cast a long shadow indeed, and it fostered a deep-seated desire for economic security among Americans. I can tell you firsthand, my grandfather, who went through all of this, was one of the most secure people I knew because of his experiences. Historian David M. Kennedy notes that the Depression, quote, inspired durable innovations to make individuals' lives and many economic sectors less risky. End quote. This includes the federal programs for mortgage lending that would become crucial in this post war expansion. While the New Deal didn't single handedly end the Depression, it expanded significantly the government's role in the economy as well as expanding and, in some cases, creating social welfare, setting precedents for the programs that would shape the post war landscape. It was World War II, however, that truly ignited the economic furnaces and ascend American economic power. Massive government spending on war production pulled the United States out of the Depression and into an era of sustained economic boom. This economic transformation was built upon a foundation that was indeed laid much earlier, during the Gilded Age of the late 19th century. That era, as we saw the rise of industrial capitalism, the consolidation of corporate power, and the birth of a mass consumer market. While the post World War II period witnessed what economists have called the Great Compression, a time when income inequality actually plummeted, the underlying structures of American capitalism, with its potential for vast wealth accumulation as well as wealth disparities, remained. The Gilded Age had been characterized by extreme wealth concentration alongside significant labor exploitation and poverty. The affluent society, for a time, seemed to temper these extremes, but the potential for inequality, as economist John Kenneth Galbraith would soon warn, was far from extinguished. The managerial techniques and national marketplace developed during the Gilded Age provided a blueprint for the scale and scope of the post World War II economy. It's worth considering whether the Great Compression was a fundamental shift or a temporary deviation, a product of a unique post war circumstances like strong unions, progressive taxation, and American dominance of global economic position, rather than a permanent restructuring of the economic tendencies established in earlier eras. And perhaps most crucially, the unresolved legacy of Reconstruction now once again loomed large. The failure to secure genuine racial equality after the Civil War directly led to the entrenchment of Jim Crow in the South and systemic discrimination across the nation. As one of our documents notes, quote, emboldened Confederate veterans and former enslavers organized a reign of terror that effectively nullified constitutional amendments designed to provide black people equal protection and the right to vote, end quote. This deeply embedded racial hierarchy formed a stark, undeniable contradiction with a society proclaiming affluence and democratic ideals. The civil rights movement of the 1950s was then, in essence, a long overdue reckoning with these failures. One of the most visible manifestations of post war affluence was the explosion of suburban growth. Central to this was the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, popularly known as the GI Bill of Rights. This landmark legislation offered returning veterans low interest home loans, stipends for college or vocational training, and loans to start businesses. As the Bill of Rights notes, quote, the GI Bill was a piece of bipartisan legislation that historians have generally praised for its far-seeing policy of rewarding service in the military. It set the stage for post-war abundance and prosperity, end quote. It was a powerful engine propelling millions of veterans and their families into an expanding middle class. The quintessential image of this suburban dream was Levittown. Developer William Levitt applied mass production techniques, much like Henry Ford had with automobiles a generation earlier, to construct thousands of affordable, standardized homes. The first Levittown, which rose on Long Island farmland in 1946, offered veterans and their families the promise of a detached house with modern amenities, often for less than the cost of renting an apartment in the city. The result was a dramatic demographic shift. The suburban share of the American population climbed from 19.5% in 1940 to 30.7% by 1960, and home ownership rates surged. Fueling this boom alongside the GI Bill were federal agencies like the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, and the Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC. Originally, these were New Deal initiatives, and their programs were expanded after the war, ensuring long term, low down payment mortgages that made homeownership accessible to a much broader segment of the white middle class. As one legal scholar observed, quote, the early FHA really created the modern American housing finance system, as well as the look and feel of post World War II suburban communities, end quote. However, this suburban dream had deeply discriminatory underside. The HOLC and the FHA institutionalized the practice of redlining. Using residential security maps, neighborhoods with minority populations, particularly African American communities, were outlined in red and deemed hazardous for investment. This designation meant that residents in these areas were effectively denied federally backed mortgages. As one analysis of the FHA practices states, quote, the FHA reflected the widely held prejudices and discriminatory practices already endemic in the all-white housing and mortgage lending industries. The FHA also drew red lines on its underwriting maps to cordon off blocks in which even a single non-white family lived. End quote. Compounding this were restrictive covenants, legally binding clauses in the property deeds themselves that explicitly prohibited the sale or rental of homes to non-whites, especially African Americans, but also Asian Americans and Latinos. The new suburban developments, including the famous Levitt towns, were often built with these exclusionary clauses from the outset. As NYU historian Edward Berenson notes, quote, Levitt towns weren't open to all. Their story is marked by racial segregation, end quote. The FHA's own underwriting manual explicitly linked higher property values to racial homogeneity, thus endorsing these discriminatory practices. The consequences were devastating and long-lasting. Systemic exclusion from federally subsidized suburban homeownership concentrated black populations in under-resourced urban areas, while white families built significant wealth through appreciating home values that grew in the suburbs. And this wasn't a passive outcome. It was the direct result of federal policy. In the film In the Suburbs, produced in 1957 by Redbook magazine, explicitly targeted advertisers by showcasing the, quote, happy-go-spending, buy-it-now young adults of today, end quote, these white suburban customers who were, quote, flocking to the suburbs to escape global and urban turmoil, end quote. This ideal image of suburbia was inherently racialized. The GI Bill and FHA programs, therefore, stand as a stark example of how government initiatives can simultaneously create opportunity for one group while denying it for another, actively shaping or exacerbating racial inequality. The American dream of home ownership, the primary vehicle for the middle class wealth accumulation in this post-war era, was largely and by design a white dream. The wealth built by white families in these federally subsidized, appreciating suburban homes became generational wealth. Black families, largely barred from this opportunity, faced a widening economic gap, the repercussions of which are still evident today in disparities in wealth, education, and even health outcomes. Furthermore, the migration to the suburbs was not merely a quest for green lawns and good schools, it was also intertwined with social and racial anxieties. The desire to escape the perceived problems of increasing diverse cities and to maintain racial homogeneity, as suggested by the Red Book's film's language in escaping urban turmoil, was a significant, if often unspoken, driver of suburbanization. This mass movement reconfigured American geography along stark racial and class lines, contributing to the very urban challenges from which many suburbanites sought refuge and creating new, enduring social and political divisions. The gleaming promise of the affluent society stood in stark contrast to the lived realities of millions of Americans, particularly African Americans, for whom the era's prosperity remained largely out of reach. The battle for equality, especially in education, became the central drama of the 1950s. For over half a century, the Supreme Court's 1896 decision in Plessy versus Ferguson had enshrined the doctrine of separate but equal, providing a legal cover for a vast system of racial segregation. But in 1954, a thunderclap occurred. Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. In this landmark ruling, a unanimous Supreme Court declared that state-sponsored segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, directly overturning Plessy in the realm of education. The court's core finding was unequivocal, quote, separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, end quote. This was a monumental victory for the civil rights movement, a powerful moral and legal tool to begin dismantling the edifice of Jim Crow. It signaled that the federal government, at its highest judicial level, was finally challenging the legitimacy of segregation. However, the promise of Brown win quickly ran into a wall of resistance. In 1955, in a follow-up decision known as Brown 2, the Supreme Court ordered that desegregation proceed, quote, with all deliberate speed, end quote, which is very vague. And this phrase, which was intended perhaps as a pragmatic concession to the complexities of implementing this, proved to be a loophole exploited by southern states to delay and obstruct for as long as possible. As one analysis of this notes, quote, it was an ambiguous phrase that allowed many Southern judges to avoid desegregation for years, end quote. And when I say years, I mean 15 or more. The defiance was formalized in 1956 with the Southern Manifesto. Over 100 Southern congressmen signed this document denouncing the Brown decision as a, quote, clear abuse of judicial power, end quote, and pledging to use, quote, all lawful means to reverse this decision. This set the stage for years of bitter struggle. The nation and the world witnessed this struggle unfold dramatically in Little Rock in Arkansas in 1957. When 9 African American students, who became known as the Little Rock Nine, attempted to integrate Central High School, they were met with raw hatred and official obstruction. Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus mobilized the state's National Guard not to protect the students, but to block their entry into the school. A furious white mob surrounded Central High, spewing vitriol and hate and threats. Elizabeth Eckford, one of the 9, arrived alone that first day, having missed the message where to meet as a group. She faced the mob by herself. Accounts from the time describe the scene vividly. Quote, they called out for her to be lynched and yelled slogans like 2468, we don't want to integrate. The image of Hazel Bryan, a white student, her face contorted in a scream of hate directed at Eckford, became an infamous symbol of the era's bigotry, end quote. The crisis escalated to the point where President Dwight D. Eisenhower, initially reluctant to intervene forcefully and also not very happy about the Brown decision in general, he felt compelled to actually act. He federalized the Arkansas National Guard and deployed units of the U.S. Army's 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock to enforce the federal court order and protect the black students. In a televised address to the nation, Eisenhower stated firmly, quote, mob rule cannot be allowed to override the decision of the courts, end quote. The courage of the Little Rock Nine in the face of such adversity was extraordinary. Daisy Bates, their mentor and president of the Arkansas NAACP, captured the bittersweet nature of their fight. Quote, any time it takes 11,500 soldiers to assure 9 Negro children their constitutional rights in a democratic society, I can't be happy, end quote. And even with federal protection, the students faced daily harassment inside the school. Carlotta Walls Lanier, one of the 9, recalled being told by school officials, quote, you're not going to be able to go to the football games or basketball games. You can't go to the prom, end quote. Elizabeth Eckford herself had echoed many of these sentiments, noting that she was often pushed into lockers or her books knocked out of her hands. Minor aggressions all day long, from the harassment vocally to also being forced to sit alone and be alone all day. Across the South, states adopted these strategies that they called massive resistance. Virginia, under the leadership of U.S. Senator Harry F. Byrd Sr., was a key architect of this massive resistance approach. Laws were passed to cut off state funding and even close any public school that attempted to integrate. In Prince Edward County, Virginia, officials took the extreme step of closing all public schools from 1959 to 1964 rather than to desegregate the schools. White students attended newly established private, what we would call segregation academies, often funded by state tuition grants, while black students in the county were left with no formal education for 5 years. The human cost was immense. Reverend Wyatt T. Walker of Petersburg, Virginia, highlighted the broader impact, stating that protesters were, quote, just as concerned about 13,000 white children being locked out of schools as they are about segregated schools, end quote. While the fight for educational equality raged, other fronts in the civil rights movement in the 1950s were also heating up. An often overlooked but really crucial legal victory came in 1954 with Hernandez versus Texas. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously that Mexican Americans, and indeed all other racial and ethnic groups, were entitled to equal protection under the 14th Amendment, specifically addressing their systemic exclusion from juries. This decision was significant for extending civil rights protections beyond the black-white paradigm that had dominated much of the national conversation. Remember, Mexican Americans are here too. Then in December of 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks, a seasoned activist with the NAACP, made her historic stand by refusing to give up her seat on a segregated city bus to a white man. Her arrest ignited the Montgomery bus boycott. Think about this. A 381-day display of community solidarity and nonviolent resistance. Black people did not take the bus for over a year. It was led by Women's Political Council and the newly formed Montgomery Improvement Association, and tens of thousands of black citizens either walked, carpooled, or organized to cripple the city's transit system in order to desegregate. And the boycott propelled a young minister, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., to national prominence. His powerful oratory galvanized the movement. At a mass meeting early in the boycott, he declared, quote, if we are wrong, the Supreme Court of this nation is wrong. If we are wrong, the Constitution of the United States is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong, end quote. Later, reflecting on the sacrifices made, King said this, quote, we came to see that, in the long run, it is more honorable to walk in dignity than ride in humiliation. So we decided to substitute tired feet for tired souls and walk the streets of Montgomery, end quote. The boycott ended in December of 1956 after the Supreme Court affirmed a lower court ruling that bus segregation was unconstitutional. The spirit of nonviolent direct action spread. Beginning in Greensboro, North Carolina in February 1960, student-led sit-ins targeted segregated lunch counters across the South. Young black students, often joined by white allies, would sit patiently, demanding service, enduring verbal abuse, physical assaults like cigarettes being burned on their arms, and arrests. Their disciplined nonviolence exposed the brutality of segregation to a national audience. Remember, TVs and cameras are rolling now in ways they hadn't been before. In 1961, the Freedom Rides, organized by the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, directly challenged segregation on interstate buses and in terminal facilities. Riders faced horrific violence, particularly in Alabama, where one bus was firebombed in Anniston, and riders were brutally beaten in Birmingham and Montgomery, again, to a nation horrified at seeing these images playing on their televisions and in their newspapers. Student leader Diane Nash, when urged to call off the rides due to the violence, famously responded, quote, we can't let them stop us with violence. If we do, the movement is dead. The relentless pressure from these activists eventually forced the new Kennedy administration to intervene and the Interstate Commerce Commission to issue regulations banning segregation in interstate travel. Amidst these highly visible struggles for civil rights, it's crucial to remember the plight of other marginalized groups. The 1952 testimony of Juanita Garcia, a pro-union American-born migrant farmer in California's Imperial Valley, offers a stark window into the other America, as she put it. She spoke to Congress about the dire poverty, the displacement of citizen workers by laborers from the Bracero program, and undocumented immigrants from Mexico who were forced to accept rock-bottom wages and the violent suppression of efforts to unionize. This is what Garcia said, quote, "For poor people like us who are field laborers, making a living has always been hard. The wetbacks and nationals from Mexico have the whole Imperial Valley. The wages get worse every year. Sometimes they make only $5 a week. That is not enough to live on, so many people cannot send their children to school," end quote. Her testimony concluded with a plea that resonated with the experiences of many forgotten Americans in this era of supposed universal affluence. Quote, "Isn't the government supposed to help us poor people? Can't it act faster in cases like this?" End quote. These varied struggles underscore complex dynamics. The federal government, for instance, acted as both an enabler and a reluctant enforcer of civil rights. While Supreme Court decisions like Brown and the Hernandez provided crucial legal foundations, and the executive branch under Eisenhower and Kennedy did intervene at crucial junctures, these actions were often reactive, not proactive. They were frequently forced by crises and violence, and the sustained activism that laid bare the contradiction between America's democratic rhetoric, especially potent during the Cold War, and the harsh realities of the state-sponsored racism. The very phrase of all deliberate speed in Brown 2 signaled the reluctance to mandate immediate sweeping change. Furthermore, the visible prosperity of the affluent society, so widely celebrated and enjoyed by wealthy white Americans, served as a powerful catalyst for more civil rights action. The stark contrast between this affluence and the continued denial of basic rights and economic opportunities for Black Americans and other minorities sharpened the sense of injustice and fueled the movement's urgency. The promise of American freedom and opportunity, amplified by Cold War propaganda, created a standard against which the nation's profound failures on race and discrimination were increasingly judged and found wanting. The fight for justice was not monolithic. While the Black civil rights movement was the dominant and transformative force, the experiences of people like Juanita Garcia and the legal battles fought by Mexican Americans remind us that the affluent society contained multiple layers of marginalization. These diverse struggles for dignity and equality, though perhaps less central in some historical narratives of the 1950s, were integral to this era's landscape and prefigured the broader social justice movements that would erupt in our next episode on the 1960s. While battles for racial justice raged, the cultural landscape of the affluent society was also undergoing subtle but significant shifts, often beneath a surface dying to create an ideal conformity. The era is famously associated with traditional gender roles and the idealized nuclear family, but discontent and new ideas were beginning to stir. Society in the 1950s placed immense pressure on women to find their primary fulfillment as wives and mothers. The happy homemaker ideal was relentlessly promoted through the media, through advertising, and even government propaganda. It was a common joke with a sharp edge of truth that women attended college to earn their, quote, MRS degree, or their Mrs. degree. That is, to find a husband. As one analysis puts it, quote, American society in the 1950s was geared toward the family. Marriage and children were part of the national agenda, end quote. This domestic ideal was even weaponized in the Cold War. American propaganda contrasted the supposed drudgery of women's lives under communism with the idealized image of American women enjoying the fruits of capitalism and freedom in her well-appointed suburban home. Vice President Nixon, during the kitchen debates, explicitly linked American domestic comforts, and by implication, the role of women within that domestic sphere. That is why, in his estimation, the American system was superior. Yet beneath this carefully curated image, a profound unease was growing. Betty Friedan, in her groundbreaking 1963 book, The Feminine Mystique, gave voice to what she termed, quote, the problem that has no name. This was a widespread sense of dissatisfaction, boredom, and lack of fulfillment experienced by many college-educated, middle-class suburban housewives who, according to the prevailing ideology, should have been perfectly content with being homemakers. Friedan wrote, quote, each suburban wife struggles with it alone, as she made the beds, shopped for groceries, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, lay beside her husband at night. She was afraid to even ask of herself the silent question, is this all? End quote. Friedan argued that the feminine mystique, the cultural insistence that women could only find true happiness in domesticity, that is, being wives and mothers and homemakers, denied them of their full human potential by limiting their aspirations and achievements to those that they could have only in the home. She powerfully asserted, quote, the only way for a woman, as for a man, to find herself, to know herself as a person, is by creative work of her own, end quote. Her work questioned the very foundations of 1950s gender expectations, asking, quote, who knows what women can be when they are finally free to become themselves, end quote. Men, too, face new pressures and anxieties in this era. The rise of large corporations and bureaucratic organizations led to the emergence of the organization man, often clad in a gray flannel suit. This new model of white-collar masculinity, which valued teamwork, sociability, and conformity, stood in stark contrast to the older American ideal of the rugged, independent, self-made man. Social commentators of the time expressed concerns that corporate life was breeding passivity and even emasculating men, robbing them of their individuality and control. As one scholar notes, quote, social commentators attacked corporate work and white-collar lifestyles, claiming that they caused passivity and emasculated men. In response to these perceived pressures, alternative visions of masculinity also emerged. Playboy magazine, first published in 1953, championed a bachelor ideal, a bachelor lifestyle, emphasizing consumption, leisure, and freedom from the perceived constraints of domestic responsibility, offering a direct counterpoint to the dominant family-centric male ideal. Your job was not only to be the breadwinner, but an ideal father. This was also an era when television transformed American life, and I can't stress that enough. In 1950, only 12% of American households owned a television set. By the end of the decade, by 1960, that number had skyrocketed to over 87%. TV quickly became the focal point of family entertainment and a powerful force in shaping a shared national culture, similar to how radio, but for better or worse. It was a voracious engine of consumerism. Advertisements now beamed directly into living rooms, and it fueled desire for a dazzling new array of products, from the latest refrigerators and washing machines to shiny new automobiles. As one analysis states, quote, advertisements became a staple of TV programming, encouraging viewers to buy the latest products. This helped fuel the post-war economic boom and shaped a culture of consumption, end quote. Popular shows like Leave It to Beaver and Father Knows Best endlessly presented idealized images of white, middle-class, suburban nuclear families, trying to reinforce traditional gender roles and a specific vision of that American dream. Beyond television, other technological innovations were shaping and reshaping daily life and societal landscapes. Plastics, developed earlier, became truly ubiquitous in the 1950s. Initially marketed for their durability, the industry soon shifted its focus, as urged by Lloyd Stauffer, editor of Modern Plastics in 1956, who told executives, your future is in the trash can. This push towards disposability helped create what critics now call a throwaway culture, a concept that was initially really difficult to sell to a generation that had experienced the scarcity of the early 1900s and especially the scarcity of the Great Depression and wartime rationing. The first credit cards emerged in the 1950s, making it easier than ever to buy now and pay later, further stoking the fires of consumer spending. Convenience foods like TV dinners, introduced in 1953, and home microwave ovens, available from 1955, began to alter eating habits and family routines. Think of TV dinners and what that actually means. Microwaving a dinner to eat in front of the television. Much different family dynamic. On a profoundly different note, the development and the dissemination of the Salk polio vaccine in 1955 was a monumental medical triumph, conquering a dreaded disease that had terrorized families for decades and allowed children to experience more carefree lives. As one contemporary account put it, the vaccine's discovery, quote, allowed citizens to resume normal activities in the summer, end quote. Meanwhile, early computers and the invention of the microchip in 1958, while primarily confined to the government and the military, and had large business applications during the 50s, were quietly laying the foundation for the digital revolution that would redefine the world in the decades to come. That is, the world you live in now. Beneath the surface of consensus and conformity, critical voices question the direction of the affluent society. I had already mentioned Harvard economist John Kenneth Galbraith, and in his influential 1958 book called The Affluent Society, which is the title of this lecture and of the textbook, acknowledged the era's unprecedented material wealth but offered a stinging critique. He argued that an economy fixated on private production and consumption systematically neglected public goods and services. It would neglect the funding of schools, of healthcare, of infrastructure, and environmental protection, leading to a paradoxical state of, quote, private opulence and public squalor, end quote. Galbraith famously questioned an economic system where, quote, wants are increasingly created by the process by which they are satisfied, end quote, pointing to the power of advertising and marketing to the manufacturing of desire. The kitchen debate between Nixon and Khrushchev in 1959 was more than a symbolic fight. It was a distillation of the era's ideological contest. While Nixon extolled the virtues of American consumerism, Khrushchev offered sharp retorts, for instance, saying, quote, your capitalist attitude toward women does not occur under communism, end quote. And boasting of Soviet durability, he said, quote, we build firmly, we build for our children and grandchildren, end quote. The pressure to conform in the 1950s was intense, and fear was a potent political tool. The Lavender Scare, a lesser known but devastating parallel to the anti-communist Red Scare, saw the systematic persecution of homosexuals within the federal government. Homosexuals were deemed security risks, supposedly vulnerable to blackmail by communist agents, and therefore morally unfit for public service. President Eisenhower's Executive Order 10450, issued in 1953, effectively banned gay men and lesbians from all federal employment and had ripple effects in the private sector as well. The depth of prejudice was starkly revealed in a 1950 speech by Nebraska Congressman Arthur L. Miller, who offered to, quote, strip the fetid, stinking flesh off of this skeleton of homosexuality for his colleagues, end quote. He painted a lurid picture of vast homosexual underworld in Washington, D.C., claiming, quote, it is amazing that in the capital city of Washington we are plagued with such a large group of those individuals, end quote. And he even linked homosexuality to foreign, specifically Russian, influence. Quote, it is a known fact that the Russians are strong believers in homosexuality, end quote. Even within the dominant white Christian majority, the lines of division existed. John F. Kennedy's 1960 presidential campaign at the end of this decade, for example, had to directly confront and deal with deep-seated anti-Catholic prejudice in the country, culminating in his significant speech on the separation of church and state. Amidst these cultural currents, educational horizons were also expanding. Beyond the transformative impact of the GI Bill, the 1950s saw a growing middle class with increasing family wealth. For these families, a college education was increasingly viewed as, quote, the ticket to economic and social mobility. As a result, undergraduate enrollment roughly doubled between the immediate post war years and 1961, marking the early stages of what we call massification in higher education that would accelerate dramatically in the 1960s. The burgeoning consumer culture of the 1950s, while providing the material comforts and fueling impressive economic growth, was indeed a double edged sword. It fostered a sense of national identity and progress, yet it also prompted critiques of conformity and superficiality from thinkers like Galbraith. It led to the creation of artificial wants, as Galbraith had noted and as Betty Friedan implicitly explored in the context of women's lives. It also sowed the seeds of future environmental concerns, particularly with the rise of disposable plastics. Similarly, the era's technological advancements presented a paradox of liberation and constraint. Television and labor-saving appliances offered undeniable convenience and new forms of entertainment. However, television also played a role in reinforcing narrow social norms, and household appliances, while easing the physical burdens of domestic labor, did not necessarily liberate women from the domestic sphere, but rather reshape their work within it, as the subjects of Friedan's research still felt profoundly trapped. The Salk vaccine freed society from a terrifying disease, a clear liberation. Yet the rapid adoption of plastics, initially seen as a boon, led to long-term environmental challenges. This demonstrates that technological progress during the affluent society was not inherently or uniformly positive. Its social impacts were complex, often contradictory, and profoundly shaped by cultural and economic systems into which these innovations were introduced. In other words, they were a product of their time. The intense pressure to conform in terms of gender roles, sexuality, and political viewpoints can be understood as an attempt to impose stability and unity on a world perceived as increasingly dangerous and rapidly changing due to several things like the Cold War, the nuclear threat, and shifting social structures. Deviance from these norms was often equated with disloyalty to the country or instability, often in the urban areas. And this created significant internal societal pressures that would directly contribute to the counterculture and the explosion of social justice movements in the 1960s, the title of our next episode. The narrative of the affluent society, as presented in your textbook, is a quintessential American story, one of progress intertwined with struggle, of ideals proclaimed yet often deferred or denied for significant portions of the population. This era was not a static endpoint of American development, but a dynamic, deeply contested period. Its legacy is complex. The aspirations forged in this era, the dream of suburban homeownership, the expectation of consumer comforts, the belief in technological progress, continue to shape American life today. So too do the anxieties born from nuclear fears, social conformity, and persistent inequalities. The battle lines drawn over civil rights and gender roles in the 1950s remain relevant to the social and political landscape today. The popular image of the 1950s often lends itself towards a monolith of white middle-class homogeneity and consensus. However, as we've explored, a closer examination reveals a society far more diverse in experience, rife with active resistance to injustice, and simmering with critical dissent beneath its polished surface. Recognizing this internal diversity and the myriad of contestations is crucial for a more historical understanding, for appreciating the continuities between the affluent society and the more overtly turbulent decades that follow. We can't understand the 1960s and 70s unless we understand what the affluent society was. This period serves as a crucible where many of the defining characteristics and enduring conflicts of modern America were forged. I'll conclude with the words of Martin Luther King Jr., spoken during the Montgomery bus boycott, when he captured the enduring spirit of the struggle for justice that defines so much of this era and the one to come. Quote, "We are determined here in Montgomery to work and fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream." Thanks for joining me on Star-Spangled Studies. I'll see y'all in the past.